I want to welcome author Mark Guarino, who's authored the new book, Sounds of Chicago, History of Country Music and the Folk Revival in Chicago. The book has been published by the University of Chicago Press, and which has graciously given the Village a discount code for his book. And that information is provided in the email that went out. Mark is a journalist who writes about culture, national news, and all points in between. He's a contributing writer to the Washington Post, where he frequently covers Chicago and the Midwest. His journalism also appears in several other national and local media. He was also the pop music critic for the Chicago Daily Herald for 11 years and is a frequent media guest to talk about his work. So we want to extend a special welcome today to Mark, and we look forward to his presentation.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. Trying to adjust my screen here. No, it's a real pleasure to be here. I know that I was at the Hyde Park Historical Society when I was still writing the book a couple of years ago. And I love that little building that I was in. And Hyde Park really does figure into this history. I can give you sort of a broad view of the book. The book covers about 100 years of history, and starting in 1924 and continuing really past the 2000. And it covers this really wide range of history that amazingly really hasn't been written about for so long. And my interest in getting into the book was that I had worked as a music critic for the Daily Herald, as you mentioned, for about 11 years. And so I really rigorously covered the Chicago music scene. And then after the Daily Herald for the Tribune and the Sun-Times. And what I found really puzzling was that a lot of stories I had written about really were connected to a lot of things that came before. There was this really tradition of singer-songwriters, country music, folk music, in Chicago, but there was really no connective, like there was really no one really connecting the dots between all of that music and all of the kind of really pivotal moments of history that led to today. Um, and I was astonished that there are so many books written about the blues and jazz histories, which are so deep, and also Chicago gospel music. But boy, this was kind of very under the radar. And so I spent about 10 plus years really working on this book for researching, interviewing people, doing a lot of traveling to look at archives, and I sew the story together into the book that was released in April. I'm kind of talking off the cuff, so if people have questions, feel free to throw them at me. I You talked about well, I'll start in the beginning of the book. The book opens in 1924, and really it's the advent of radio. Radio is, had been around years before, but it was really, things were speeding up very fast, and household radio sets were entering the common household, and they were flying off the shelves so fast that a lot of the technical high schools, like Lane Tech on the north side, the students were making amateur radio kits because there was a very strong demand for radio in the home. And WLS started in April 1924. And it was owned by Sears Roebuck Company, the world's largest store, is what WLS stood for, which a lot of people know. And in April 1924, it was very similar to what I think of when I think of today with streaming media. That there's this technology that is completely new, but people were still trying to figure out what to put on the airwaves. So you had the technology, but there was no content to put on there. And so all the early radio stations in Chicago, they were doing things like recording the lyric opera. They would have people reading bedtime stories to children. They would have someone reciting Shakespeare. Um, and Saturday night, there was they didn't know what to put on. And so there was a program director named Edgar Bill who said, well, we can put some fiddlers on. We'll get some fiddlers into the studio and they'll just play old time fiddle tunes. And it was so popular that telegrams, even that night, were coming in real time. People loved it. And that some musicians were jumping the streetcar to go down to the station to join them in the studio. So the first night was a huge success, and they decided to call it the Barn Dance. And um, the barn dance was really, that was the kind of pivotal moment of not just Chicago radio history, but really the history of country music, because it was really the first time that music that was really played, that was really an oral tradition that really had come from the Appalachia and had kind of moved to Chicago because people were moving here for jobs. Um, had become commercialized, had become sort of the barn dance was a Saturday night variety program that produced a lot of the earliest recording stars of country music. And what they were recording was essentially folk songs that were passed among over many generations, had changed. And now that they were recording them for a mass audience and then performing them on the radio. And within a few years, Sears Roebuck sold WLS to an agricultural magazine called Prairie Farmer. And Prairie Farmer still exists today. It was a magazine for rural America, for farmers. So they had information about hogs and soybean crops. And WLS was really a way to talk with them, talk with rural America throughout the Midwest. And so that was really the first time the music was now transported over the airwaves into people's homes. And it sounds like a simple thing today, but it was really monumental because it was really speeding up the process of delivery of this music. And you had stars who were coming to Chicago and were given new names, were given back, were given false backstories, were put into costumes, and were sent on the road. And so when the barn dance wasn't airing, they were touring throughout the Midwest and playing county fairs and local community halls, and they were recording. And so it was really the first time that this music had been became a commodity. And the Grand Ole Opry, which still exists today, came after the barn dance and actually was started by the first announcer at the barn dance. Um, and the reason why that we remember the Grand Ole Opry today and we don't really remember the barn dance was because the Prairie Farmer was a very conservative, the people who ran it were very, very conservative. And as the music was changing after World War II, it was getting a little, you had people like Hank Williams and Kitty Wells, people who were writing original songs, not folk songs, but they were really original songs, um, very psychological songs about, love and loss and loneliness and heartache. And they were, Hank Williams is considered the Shakespeare of country music. He was a brilliant songwriter because he was able to use metaphors to really talk about profound things in the human existence. And but Prairie Farm was very scared of that direction because it wasn't entertainment. It wasn't just, it wasn't just light entertainment. And so it resisted that. And so the future of the music, the Grand Ole Opry really embraced that. And so after World War II, the barn dance became very irrelevant, creatively, and just faded away. But at its height, it had a national sponsor. It was coast to coast. It really was. It really served the music, and kind of made it stand up on 2 feet. And then kind of by the 1950s, Nashville became the city where a lot of the recording studios were. So the industry of country music was starting to sort of really kind of come together in the 1950s in Nashville. And that's when the barn dance's prominence really, really faded. And so that first chapter, talking about sort of this big boom of what Chicago really became a landmark place for the development of country music, really kind of sets things up for the rest of the book because That was many decades that the barn dance was here, and so people had memories of it. And and then following the barn dance, you had this migration, kind of the second great migration to Chicago was the white Appalachians from the middle, from kind of the upland South, Tennessee, Kentucky, Southern Indiana, were coming here for jobs. And so you had this major, because the agricultural jobs were dying out, and so you had a population drain from the south, and they were moving to cities in the north for opportunity. And they were bringing their music with them. They were bringing their instruments with them and their culture with them. And so kind of the middle part of this last century, you had this migration of Southerners moving to places like Uptown on the north side, really kind of throughout the north side, but really concentrated there. And after 1929, the stock market crash, Uptown, which was the glamorous, um, like sort of playground for the wealthy in Chicago, it went into to deep decline. A lot of blight, a lot of slumlords moved in, and it was cheap housing, and that's where a lot of the white Southerners moved. And so it became known as hillbilly heaven after a while, and it was really a very difficult place to live for these people because they were in cramped housing. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of police oppression. The city did not want the people there. And but on the flip side of it, all the commercial corridors of in Uptown became a place where there were a lot of saloons, and there were a lot of what I would call storefront honky tonks. So classic storefront Chicago bars, but they were country bars. And the jukeboxes were filled with country music. And there was like, so this is developed, I'm kind of like giving the capsule, but this is like developed over decades. And there was a couple really interesting things that kind of developed out of this phenomenon. One is it coincided later with urban renewal, and Hyde Parkers know a lot about urban renewal as well. And urban renewal up on the north side was, Mayor Daley really wanted to really gentrify that area. And so there was a real push against the Southerners there. They were really um, there was a lot of, I mean, my book is filled with stories of really interactions with the police and the city, and also places like the Chicago Tribune. If you read the media of that day, they really talk to these people about these people in very derogatory terms. Um, but out of that came kind of a lot of music and poetry. There was a real resistance against the powers that be in City Hall. And a lot of the gangs, the white street gangs, aligned with other gangs, the Puerto Rican street gangs, and the Black Panthers, and they formed this sort of resistance against them. And but they wrote music. There was music involved in a lot of this. So you had these kind of unlikely people, who would have nothing to do with each other except they had one common cause. They kind of united, and that is kind of a really interesting story. They wanted to have, and within Uptown, there was a plan to have sort of of a subdivision called Hank Williams Village, um, where it would be kind of like a welcoming center or welcoming area for people. Because if you think about it, the people who were moving here, they were moving here for jobs, but they had the conditions that they were not used to city life at all. The winters here were harsh. They had not experienced winter. The living conditions were very cramped. They were not used to living in cramped living. They were living on farms and in rural areas. So everything was completely foreign to the people moving up here. So the Hank Williams Village was a way to sort of kind of ease the transition into Chicago. But eventually, the pressure of the Daley administration got the investors to move out of it, so that kind of went away. But that story is in my book. The second thing that kind of comes out of that great migration is that at the same time, in about the 60s, um, there was this resurgence of interest in bluegrass music because of things like the Beverly Hillbillies theme, or the movies like the movie Deliverance, which had a hit song, Dueling Banjos, on it. people had never really, young people who were listening to rock and roll had never heard of banjo before. And so there was this kind of really interesting phenomenon of middle-class white kids in the Chicago suburbs discovering acoustic music for the first time. But if they wanted to play that music, where would they go? They couldn't go anywhere. It wasn't being taught in school at all. So they went to Uptown. And so the book is kind of filled with stories of these like middle-class white kids, getting their mom to drop them off, or, if they were teenagers driving down from, Morton Grove or wherever they lived, and in interacting with a lot of these musicians. And I found a lot of really beautiful stories of the kind of interacting with people who had nothing to do with each other except for like handing over the music, or just like sharing this real passion for the music. um and that kind of brings me to like the University of Chicago Folk Festival, which obviously everyone here is very much aware of. But the history of that folk festival is sort of this in the same spirit of what I'm talking about. The folk festival started in 1961, and but a couple years beforehand, in the 50s, there were some things happening in Chicago that kind of led up to it. The reason why that it started in 61. The first one is, in 1956, the Gate of Horn was a nightclub that started down in the downtown, like the Rush Street district, where there were a lot of jazz clubs and cabaret clubs and comedians and people were. It was nightlife in Chicago in the 50s. Um, but there was not a at the same time, folk music was becoming very popular among younger people, because this was the time when the Smithsonian and a lot of other record labels were reissuing music that was recorded back in the 20s and the 30s. And people had never heard this music before until these reissues. So there were some monumental records coming out, and kids who were kind of reacting against rock and roll were embracing that music. And so the Gate of Horn was the first nightclub on the national scale it took the music from coffee shops and universities and brought it into a place where alcohol was served. And it was a true nightclub. It was where white middle class professionals could go and dress up in suits and go have a cocktail and listen to a folk singer, which sounds kind of quaint today, but it was completely brand new. And it was so popular that musicians could make a living playing there. And so people were coming from New York to play there, to audition for Albert Grossman, who was a West Side of Chicago native, who, after he opened the Gate of Horn, he famously became the first manager of Bob Dylan. And he was one of the first rock and roll managers. He created Peter, Paul and Mary. He managed Janis Joplin, not the Doors, but the band. And so we used the Gate of Horn as this launching point for going out east and becoming this impresario of rock music. So he opened that in 1956, and then in 1957, the doors of the Old Town School of Folk Music opened, and all three founders met at the Gate of Horn. And so the Gate of Horn really became this pivotal place. So you had that stuff happening. Now the Old Town School is now it's becomes you have two sort of headquarters for folk music. So in 1961, there was a University of Chicago student named Mike Fleischer. And Mike was really your typical, uh, he must have been, he was a little older than a lot of the students, because first went into the army, then came back, and he hated rock and roll music. He grew up in Hyde Park, but he went to the Navy, and he'd heard in the Navy country music and folk music for the first time. He loved it and came back and decided to convince the school to to do this folk festival. Now, there was a precedent. In 1960, the Newport Folk Festival had opened. So 1 year before, in Newport, Rhode Island, that festival had started. So he used that as an example that we could do the same thing here. And he started getting a lot of the organizers from the Newport Folk Festival involved with the Chicago Festival. And that involvement really meant convincing artists to come to Chicago in February. to perform. Not the greatest weather conditions for performers who were living in the South. And one thing about one of my research, I found these letters written from University of Chicago students in 1960 to these performers who had recorded in the 20s and 30s and then more or less kind of went back to their life. They were living in rural Mississippi, rural Kentucky. Um, but the students at the University of Chicago had to find these performers and convince them to come up and play in Chicago for the first time. First of all, and for many of them, it was the first time out of the South. It was the first time in a city. It was the first time in a formal setting like Mandel Hall. And and so I found all these great letters, these like exchanges back and forth between these highly educated University of Chicago students and some people really who had no education, were much older than them. And it was kind of a beautiful thing, this kind of back and forth saying, hello, I'm so and so from the University of Chicago. We are starting a festival. We would love you to come perform. And miraculously, it happened. That first festival was kind of set the template for amazingly what is still going on in February at the festival in Chicago. It's still in Mandel Hall, still, I think 2 days. And but during the day they have workshops, and that was a big part of the vision of this kid, really a kid, Mike Fleischer, was that we're not just going to hear the music. That's not just an entertainment. We're going to like we're going to interact with you all weekend. We're going to like sit down with you in the dorms, and we're going to like get to know each other. And because the idea was that this music, it was at that period of time, it was really, there was a lot of fear about rock music. Um, and it was really the idea that this is a real American music. This is music that is of these songs and these sounds. This is truly rooted in the history of this country, and these are the people performing it. So we want to sort of pay homage to that in a way. And so Studs Terkel was the first host he was the MC. The first festival, there was the middle of a major snowstorm, and it went very long. It went past midnight, and eventually it worked out some of the kinks, and really it was the Newport Folk Festival is still running. I think it's still a foundation that's running it, but it's much more of a commercial festival. It's on a big geographical plane. It's more of like a kind of a Lollapalooza for folk music or American roots music. The University of Chicago Folk Festival is still exactly the way it was from 61. And the people who have performed on those stages are really, it's like the history of American music, very influential festival. I mean, one example that one former student told me was that, I mean, they would get into, there's one car trip that some of the students got in, they couldn't connect with some of these people, so they had to go find them. So they had to get in their car and go drive down to Mississippi and go just knock on doors and find some of these people they had heard about or they had records of. And one of those performers was Mississippi John Hurt, who is today revered as an acoustic blues performer, and his songs have been covered since then by the Rolling Stones and Bonnie Raitt. Um, but they drove to his hometown where they heard that's where he lived, and they got out of the car, and the first person on the sidewalk, they said, "Do you know John Hurt?" And they said, "Yeah, that's him crossing the street over there." And so they went over there and introduced themselves. And right away he said, "We can't talk here, just follow me." So they followed him to his house because he didn't want to be seen talking to white students, white people in the middle of, right in the heart of his town. But eventually he came to Hyde Park, and it was the first time he had ever performed in any sort of formal setting. Um, and So, the book goes kind of from the University of Chicago. I mean, it was really kind of, Hyde Park was kind of a book, as many of you, I'm sure, know, was really the heart of Bohemia for that time. There was a guitar shop called the Fret Shop on 57th Street, which no longer exists, but that was like a place where if you were interested in the music, kids would just hang out there. And so That was kind of a famous. I talk about there was a brief period of time before Bob Dylan went to New York City. He spent a month in Hyde Park and he hung out at the fret shop and the dorms, and he I think he auditioned for the University of Chicago Folk Festival, but didn't make the audition. And so, but ended up in New York. But there was a real glimmer. But in that time in New York, he had met, or in Chicago, he had met Michael Bloomfield, who was a North Shore white kid, kind of a guitar ace, he was a truant. He would leave, he wouldn't go to school. He would take the train down to Hyde Park and hang out in the fret shop. Because again, like this, what's really interesting is that the music was still so new that there really wasn't a lot of places for people to find other like-minded people to kind of share their love of the music or share songs or guitar tunings and things like that. Um, so the book kind of moves forward in time, and rock and roll had killed folk music everywhere else in the 60s, but by the 70s, it really survived. In the 70s, there was this great singer-songwriter scene on the north side of Chicago. The Old Town School of Folk Music really is credited for that because, unlike a lot of cities, you had this fundamental place that was producing musicians, and it was giving musicians a place to work, and it was keeping folk music really alive. And I have letters from Pete Seeger writing to the people working there saying how jealous he was that Chicago had a place like that. And so naturally, in the 70s, there were all these folk clubs that kind of popped up again, essentially taverns and bars, but would have live musicians. And out of that whole scene came all these 70s people like John Prine and Steve Goodman and Bonnie Colac and Jim Post and on, and Michael Smith, who's great. And then you keep kind of moving forward in the 80s. In the 90s, you had, as country music had really developed and had become more like pop music, you had bands who were forming here, people who came from punk rock in the 1980s were discovering all that music and really realizing that the do-it-yourself and nature of punk rock, which was we can just make music without record labels, we can just do it on our own. And we're working class kids, our music is about like, working class struggles. They realized that old music is has the exact same themes that we're writing about here. It's just different. It sounds different. And so you had all these bands and artists in the 90s playing country music. Really kind of people who did not grow up with country music, but really learned to love it. And that kind of all that kind of interesting creativity happening in the 90s set the stage for the next decade and the decade after it, which really Chicago was really ahead of the curve of what we call today as Americana music. It's very much all over the place, but at that time it was very underground music, and the book kind of explains, kind of gets into that sort of like what was going on in Chicago at the time that kind of really sparked that real intense movement of musicians to kind of collaborate and to play country music. Even though Nashville would not consider them country musicians, they felt that they were because they were connecting to what they felt country music was really ultimately about, and that big publishers and record labels in Nashville had sort of lost the thread on. Um, so I've been rambling for so long. I hate to dominate the whole conversation, but if anybody has any questions, please let me know.
Can you repeat the name of the club on the north side? It's the Gates of
The Gate of Horn.
Horn, Horn.
Yeah, the Gate of Horn. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. And it existed in many different locations. The first location was really the pivotal one. But then once Albert Grossman left and sold it, it had kind of moved different places. But the first one was one that's where Lenny Bruce got arrested. That was that's probably most famous for that outside of the music realm. But yeah.
Thanks.
And just to note, if you want to look in the chat box, Dottie added the link to the UFC Folk Festival, And the date is February the 9th and the 10th. So that's this weekend.
Great. Um,
Other questions? Susan, you've got your hand up. You're muted.
You're muted.
Susan, you're muted. Susan, you're muted.
No, I'm trying. There,
we
Oh,
can hear you now.
yeah.
yes.
So are you going to talk about the Saturday night special? Was this an outgrowth of the earlier radio show? And
Oh, are you talking about the midnight special?
I mean, midnight special.
Oh yeah, WFMT. Yeah, no, they were very different from because the midnight special, yeah, of course, it started the UFC ties to the midnight special, which is still running, of course, on WFMT Saturday nights. Yeah, I mentioned the midnight special throughout the book because again, very different from New York and other cities. They were an enabler of the music. So again, like that was a place that was promoting the music throughout. So you had the Old Town School, the Midnight Special. You had people like Studs Terkel, who would have musicians on his radio show. And you had a lot of very friendly newspaper writers. And so you had this kind of media ecosystem that was really passionate about the music and kind of really moving it forward. And there was no doubt, I grew up learning so much or hearing so much about the Greenwich Village folk scene. But the reality of that, the Greenwich Village, was really only around for, I would say, 5 minutes. It was around a very short period of time. Really when Bob Dylan left, when he moved out of Greenwich Village, the scene sort of left with him. And that was really only 3 years, maybe, the height of it. In Chicago, we can really talk about 2 decades of active folk musicians, singer-songwriters playing, and the Midnight Special is one of the reasons why it was really kind of the fires were stoked. I think also one theme of the book is that, and this is throughout the time periods, is that I always think like why people say, well, I never knew any of this history was here. Why didn't I ever hear about it? Well, one of the reasons is that the commercial industry was not here. There were in the time of the barn dance in the 20s, it actually was here. There were recording studios here and the major labels were here. But once it went to both coasts, it went to New York, Los Angeles, and once the country music industry started establishing itself in the 50s in Nashville, there was not a major presence here by the industry. You had to go else. If you wanted to become a star, you had to go somewhere else. But the good thing about that was that musicians really found that they could live here, they can enjoy middle-class living here, but they can also experiment and collaborate and find their voice here. And that's really what that was all about. John Prine in about 1980, he moved to Nashville, but really the first 10 years of his creative life, he was, and when he was making some of his best records, he was living here because there was, it was a safe place it wasn't a cutthroat industry town. He could kind of develop who he was as John Prine in Chicago. I think sometimes when you move to a town dominated by a creative industry, there's that pressure. Well, that person's really popular, so I'm going to be just like him because that's what the industry says. If one thing's popular, we just want 10 more versions of it because that's selling right now. And that's sort of a creatively bankrupt way to approach art. And so here you can a lot of really idiosyncratic voices and musicians kind of came out of here because they could do it because audiences welcomed it. And so that theme really is continuous throughout the book about why, the benefit of not being a commercial town. Any other questions? And you'll have to forgive me because I could just talk forever. So, but
Were there many women musicians in the early days or?
Yeah, there were. There was a woman named there actually were. There was a lot of there was a woman named Patsy Montana who came here, and she ended up being the first country music, the first female country music star. And she had I'm looking her up on my computer to make sure I have her, well, I want to put her location right. But she there was a lot of like female women in early country music were sometimes uh part of larger groups. So they would have a group of cowboy stars, and then you'd have like there'd be one woman within it. Patsy Montana was the first woman in country music to sell 1 million copies of her record.
Mm.
And she kind of showed up in the early 30s. She was from Arkansas. And she like a lot of artists on the barn dance, her name was not Patsy Montana. Her name was Ruby Blevins, and she grew up on a farm in Arkansas, and she kind of came up here um and auditioned for the barn dance and was kind of given this name. But she started writing her own songs, and the first song that she wrote was "I Want to Be a Cowboy Sweetheart," and that song was very influential and covered by 1 million people since her, because it was from a woman's perspective of being out on the range. And so she recorded up until there was sort of a revival in the 80s. There were a revival of interest in a lot of these earlier stars, and so she kept performing until she died, as Patsy Montana. So she's definitely a notable one, and there's definitely other women who emerged, whose names may have been forgotten, but their songs and their influence really kind of helped move the music forward.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Speaking of Patsy, my dad was a fan of Patsy Cline.
yeah.
Any comments or any news interest about her?
Sure. Well, I mean, for sure, she was part of that generation of country artists who were really very innovative. For the the type of songs they were recording and writing, and from what came before. So she didn't really have a presence in Chicago, so she's really not in my book much, but she was definitely part of that, um, the kind of the next wave, the development of the music from where it came before. I mean, the music on the barn dance and the performers on the barn dance, they were as connected to kind of this old way of rural life as you could get. Some of the people, like Patsy Montana, lived on farms. I mean, they were it was the first time that the music was before a microphone, and it was really from that generation. And Patsy Montana really, or Patsy Cline and Hank Williams and Webb Pierce and Kitty Wells, they were really influential for modernizing the music, that second generation to come. Um, and because the same, if you hear anything of Patsy Cline saying, the music was much more psychologically complex than the stuff that you were hearing on the barn dance at the time.
Other
Uh,
questions?
oh yeah. Any other questions?
Robin, you're muted.
Any other questions?
This is Jenny, and I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea how in the world this interest has been maintained all the way through till 2024
Interesting.
University of Chicago students, or is it really old grayheads like us that are keeping the folk festival going?
Well, that's interesting because I know that the volunteers are people like that kind of older generation who are definitely keeping it going. Like, I mean, I don't really have a lot of insight into the students who are running it now, but I can say that there is, I mean, I was talking about Americana music before, which essentially that's just a new label to talk about roots music. I like to call it roots music. And the music really is as popular as ever before. That's the amazing thing is that it wasn't really even wasn't popular really when I graduated college in 1992. It wasn't really that popular at all. And but it has become popular. And I think that I think that it's music that's really best heard performed live. I think that people there's never been a dip in people wanting to learn how to play guitars and banjos. That has never gone away. I think that it's in popular music. You hear that music wherever you go. There's a lot of the classic rock performers, their song cats, people like Tom Petty or even the Beatles, you know, their music still sustains. And a lot of that music was really, you know, they played a lot of country music and folk music was really the roots of the music they played. And so yeah, and I think that among the students, there's always going to be an interest in the music, but in terms of the festival itself, of who keeps it going, I could see why the volunteers are essential to that because the students come and go, but the volunteers, they're the continuity of it.
I do know that you know, the chairs are students, and there are a lot, you know, there are a number of older volunteers, but for whatever reason, I mean, it must be one of the largest student-run events at UFC. I mean, student-run, and they have an office in Illinois, and they meet, I think, at least twice a week throughout the year.
Yeah.
So I don't know how they keep attracting a cadre of students to work on it, but it
Yeah. No, it's
may have a cult appeal now or something. I don't know, but
well, you know, I think that anything that, I mean, students, young people will always be interested in something that's alternative to the mainstream. And
yes, and this is
nothing more,
yes.
yeah. And there's nothing more alternative than traditional music.
Well,
Because it never has gone away.
yeah.
It has always been this current that's been there. And I think that there's always been an interest in that. And there's clearly like a lot of curiosity about the people playing it and the stories that where it comes from. And I think that especially the college students, I think that's really intriguing to them because um yeah, I can see why that there's always been an appeal to it. Although I also can see why we may think, well, why would they don't seem like they would be interested in it. But you know, the first student who formed it, you know,
Right.
he formed it was because he hated Elvis Presley.
Yeah.
And he thought Elvis Presley was just junk. I mean, there's great quotes I found of him from newspaper articles just talking about he just thought it was total junk and so I mean that spirit has not gone away.
Okay.
For sure.
I
Yeah.
think I finally got unmuted. Did I succeed?
Yes, go ahead,
Okay.
Robin.
Okay, this is Robin. And other than Nina Helstein, I've probably been to more folk festivals than anybody else. Okay. I
Great.
came here in 61, but my first folk festival was the second.
Okay.
One thing I want to differ from you, it's got the same spirit as before, but on a scale of 1 to 10, it used to be a 12, and
Yeah.
now we're down around 3. Okay. Idenoise Hall, where the workshops were, a Saturday and Sunday, 2 days worth of workshops, and there were 3 days worth of concerts at Mandel. Idenoise was packed, okay, from the first floor to the third floor, and everywhere in between, with people who came from all over the country with their sleeping bags, because this really was a big thing. Most of the music was more on the country and bluegrass side, and then the folk, what became known as the folk music, and it was a mixture of the college student folk dropouts and folk music types and the Southern bluegrass types. And then we also started getting, of course, because we're in the south side of Chicago, we got blues. It broadened over the years. I can remember when when I first heard Cajun music here, and the Cajun music took over well. But the types of music broadened over the years. The spirit and the mixing, that's all, that hasn't changed, but it was much different. I can remember, wow, somebody asked about women. I can remember when Mama Yancey came out, and she was in her 80s or 90s at that point. Erwin Helfer, who's a Chicago blues musician, who's actually, I don't know if I think he's still performing a little bit.
No,
But
he is, yeah.
A little.
Yeah.
he hasn't been too well lately. But I can remember when Erwin brought Mama Yancey out on the stage, all 80 pounds of her, if that much. And we thought, oh my God, what have these people done? They've dragged this old lady out on the stage. Somebody's nodding. Was there anybody that was there at the time? She opened her mouth. That 80 pounds, 50 pounds of it was her chest. And she still could sing and belt it out. And it was just an incredible experience. And she came again. So we had, but blues was a big thing then. It's funny you mentioned Mike Bloomfield playing folk music, because I do I have my names right, or am I confused? But wasn't he with
He was with the Paul Butterfield Blues
with the
Band.
Butterfield
They were
Band?
with Bob
That's right.
Dylan. Yeah.
Yeah. He was with the Butterfield, and Elvin Bishop. I can remember Elvin sitting on the stairs of what was then called New Dorm, then Woodward Court, and got torn down. Elvin didn't talk to people much. He just sat and
That's right.
played
I
his.
interviewed Elvin for my book. Yeah, he's in the book. Yeah.
He just sat and picked at his band. Paul Butterfield was going out with now that this does not relate to folk festival. They I don't know if they ever played at folk festival, but they were definitely an important sort of a mix. But it's interesting that they came here as folk musicians and left as blues musicians.
Right.
Right. But I can remember Paul coming over after the bars closed and playing in our apartment. I was afraid we were going to get evicted because it was a little bit late to be playing music.
Right.
And the landlady lived in the building, or her son did. Anyways, thank you. But I wanted to add a little about folk festival.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's great. And Nina Helstein, I would love to. She was really great. She had a lot of recordings I listened to. She let me listen to, and so if anyone is in contact with, I emailed her a couple weeks ago. I haven't heard back from her, so I hope she's doing well.
Yeah, she's fine. Well, I haven't seen her in a few weeks, but
okay.
Last I knew, she was doing fine. There's a woman named Laura Gloger. Did you come across her name at all?
No.
Laura was very active over the years as one of the quote volunteers who brought the the old way of doing things, and she was very, very important. She has not been well. She'd be an interesting person to talk to.
Okay.
But you're finished with your book.
Yes.
Nina Helstein is very much around and active. She was at our recent lunch gathering with.
Good. Yeah.
And I saw her at a concert last night at Logan.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
And Laura, I believe, is in an assisted living in Woodlawn now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. She doesn't get out and around, but you could probably talk to her on the phone or pay her a visit if you wanted. Because
sure. Yeah, she'd like that, I'm sure.
Yeah, and you can get my number. It's best to call me in the late afternoon or evening. I'm not a morning person.
Okay.
But I can get I can help you, hook you up with them if you want. Or I guess Susan can do it too. She knows how to reach them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Years ago, maybe 15, I was at a national meeting in Nashville and we had one free evening. So a group of us, about 15, went to the Opry House. We had to get there like an hour and a half ahead of time just to get in and get a seat. And is that still as popular today?
The in which house?
The Opry House in Nashville?
Oh yeah, it is. It is, and they have the Grand Ole Opry is still broadcast every Saturday night. You can hear it on Sirius satellite radio here in Chicago on on locally in WSM, which is the same station it started on, and it is as popular as ever. Yeah, it's really kind of a bedrock of the country music industry and world, not just in presenting a lot of the veteran artists, but also introducing new artists as well that are kind of rolling out as the time. So yeah, it's still a radio broadcast, amazingly enough. At the Ryman Auditorium, which I think is where it moved sometimes it'll be at the Ryman Auditorium, which is a former church in downtown Nashville, and that's where the Opry was for many years. It moved to a big theater outside of Nashville in one of the suburbs, but occasionally the broadcast they call it the Opry at the Ryman. So sometimes it'll go back to the Ryman for special events, but it's either in one of the two places Saturday nights.
I'd like to go back to the U Chicago Folk Fest. I was a newcomer 20 years ago and had been in New York during that whole working with Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan in community organizing and the Clearwater, which was the ship that we all sailed on trying to do ecology way back in that day. I actually cooked on the wood stove in the bottom of the Clearwater for the week that I was there. But what impressed me with the folk festival was that there were all these brand new musicians, including some teenagers, but there was also older people that some of us had never heard of, but who were, central to what had been going on and to developing this kind of thing. So I loved that mix of not just having it, you had to be old timer, that there could also be teenage girls on stage with their fiddles. So to me, that was the really important thing, along with, of course, the workshops were absolutely fantastic. And I insisted that my granddaughters go with me until they moved away from Hyde Park, because it has to be passed on to new generations. And they loved the 3 o'clock dance thing at Ida Noyes every Saturday afternoon, and they danced up a storm. It was wonderful.
Yeah, it was a really interesting time in that. I mean, I found it really interesting that in that time is you can't really find that anymore, but it really was the first time that these two generations were kind of coming together over the music, and they didn't really interact before, and it was sort of like but they came together in the spirit of sharing this music. Because now you can hear, if you want to play something, you want to learn some songs, clearly the internet, everything is available to you. There's not much discovery left. But there you had to actually interact with people who where the music came from, and that was really kind of unique. In a way, it's very similar to the first time a lot of the kind of white college kids like Eldon Bishop were, sitting at the feet of a lot of these Southside blues guys. It was, again, the very similar dynamic of just the eagerness to learn and the eagerness to share too. But it had to be, sitting in the same room together. And I think that was a really very unique time that really has passed because of the advent of technology. And the loss of regionalism too, a lot of, so as I was mentioning, some of these kids had to get into a car and go drive down and go find these people, which seems very archaic to today.
And you're muted.
I just want to say we have reached our official 1 o'clock time, and I don't want to impose on people, and I don't want to impose on Mark unless he is willing and people have more questions. I, for one, am absolutely fascinated. I think it's wonderful. You've certainly piqued my interest, and I'm going to look for the book because I think I'd like to know more. So I hope others. I want to thank you so much.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was really important.
And-
Hyde Park, you're so important to this that it's great to talk to a group of Hyde Parkers about it. So thank you.
We wish you
Also
all the
wonderful
best
to
with
hear
the book.
Ginny and Robin's perspectives. Those are great too.
Yes.
We have
Absolutely.
some people around. Go ahead. Dottie, you wanted to say
Oh,
something?
I was just going to say we wish you all the best with the book.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no,
And-
it's really is.
Please make sure it's available for sale at the Folk Festival.
Yes, I hope.
I would like, I need to tell the
Oh.
University of Chicago Press that, so I will let them know. Yeah.
Ah, yes.
You got to find somebody who'll let you put it at their table.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I want to encourage everybody, come to the folk festival. It's
Yeah.
not a bigger bargain anywhere for $15.
Mhm.
You don't have to stay the whole time. It lasts, you can come and stay for an hour, stay for 2 hours. But if the folk festival is going to continue, we've got to grow the audience instead of sink the audience. And a lot of the old audience is no longer with us or no longer able to come. So we need younger people. We need more people. I have a funny story. Well, you want to get off, but I'll stay on another few minutes if anybody wants to hear a couple of funny stories about folk
Robin,
fest.
do you know if it will be recorded and streamed?
Well, it has been since COVID. And in fact, I think it's still out there. I think if you go to the website, which I'm not sure what it is, there may be links to last year's. They left it up for quite a while to see the old ones, but the concerts, it doesn't catch the essence. The concerts are great. For years, I didn't even go to the concerts. I couldn't afford it. I just went to the workshops. It was, but I would go look for it. Maybe UFC folk or something like that. But if you find their website, but the last couple of years it was streamed, and they left. And last year I know they left it up for a while. So
Wonderful.
Great.
Okay, so if people want to stay, but we are officially ended.
Thanks,
So
Mark. I'm gonna- I have to
Okay.
leave.
thank you
Thanks
so
for having
much.
me.
I really think it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Dottie